Dun 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 dun. Dun 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 dun. Dun dun dun. Oh. What goes on inside the mind of Paul? Indeed. Ah, ah, ah. Dun, 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 dun. Ah, I gotta get away. Dun, 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 dun. Oh, oh, oh.
Oh my God, don't bust
Dun,
it.
dun, 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 dun. Ah, oh, ah, don't. Ah. Ah. Indeed, a question that plagues the mind of scholars everywhere.
Jay, can you take apart the table in the basement? That's the question in mind of scholars.
Oh my gosh!
Ow. Stand. Stop. Stop. Don't. Huh.
I don't know why I just did that, but I don't understand. You shall see the house right before we move. Here is the right before we move house. There's a box. Here's Steve's room before we move. Here is Tim's room before we move. Here's the hallway before we move. The bathroom before we move. Ah! Ah!
Yeah.
The toilet before we move.
Essential sitting on the cabinet chips.
Stacy before we move.
Hi. I don't get to stay long. I'm sad. Here, how about if I just turn around? That'll make it easier for you.
Mom before we move. The can before we
You should
move.
have done that before we took everything out. I was going to let you see.
Yeah.
Well, here's your...
Going downstairs. Before we move. You don't understand how to... Jay before we move. And the guitar before we move. Ah. The saline before we move. The poster before... Jay's ear before we move. The dresser box before we move. Whee! The light bulb. Oh my gosh, a very bright light. What is it? Supplies before we move. Mom and Dad's room before we move. Mom and Daddy's bed before we move. The mirror before we move. Eep. I don't believe what I am seeing. This is the house. Oh my gosh! You have never seen anything like it. But it is the closet before we move! What is inside this mysterious chest? Let us see. Dun, 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 dun. Stuff! Before we move. What is in here? What is in the deep depths of here? Oh my gosh. What is that mysterious phenomenon? I don't know, so I'm not even gonna try and find out. This is what time it is before we move. The clock. Oh no, the clock before we move. The vacuum cleaner before we move. We know not what else. What could possibly be in this thing? Ah! Now, we travel into the world that has never been seen before. Upstairs! Up, up, outside before we move. Jay! Before we move. Jay's elbow before.
You already filmed me before we move.
I did not. Ah! A tender moment before we move.
Away,
No singing.
we must return to thee.
Now, this
And then
will be the outside before we move.
Pictures black and white.
well, no, because I don't really want a whole bunch of black and white pictures. I just want one. Like if I really like a picture, I want to make it black and white.
We shall venture
Anyway,
And then I give,
everywhere.
you know what I mean? It's like,
is your phone number on this piece of paper?
uh,
I need your Hurry fast.
She's running.
it's actually the church phone number because we don't have one yet, but we live right behind the church, so.
So maybe you'll hear it ring.
Okay.
Let's find out what is in the phenomenon of before we move. The Lincoln before we move. The inside of the Lincoln before we move. The back of the Lincoln. Oh my goodness! The Lincoln before we move. The Pluck Vic before we move.
Are you going to take a picture of Mad Buffalo Incorporated?
The front door before we move. The house before we move.
Have fun.
Her house before we move. Their house before we move. The apartments before we move. That house before we move. The weird guy's house before we move. the one and only taxi cab man's house before we move. The Thunderhead before we move. What?
If you don't want the package, fine, let's go.
Well, good luck.
Thanks.
Look cool before we move.
I know. That's how I was thinking about that.
Our neighborhood before we move. The camper before we move. No way, the propane tank before we move. The opening in the Thunderhead before we move. That truck that belongs to no one we know before we move. My old school before we move. Now this is the car of one of my favorite brothers before we move. This is Damien's car. You will see inside Damien's car, it is messy. And to tell you the truth, even sometimes, even though I don't like him, sometimes, I know he's a good kid. And this is our house and our neighborhood before we move.